The recent protests around the country have prompted officials in Boston to re-examine policies and priorities for policing and public health. Part of that response are several new proposals from city councilors. To tell us about those, along with the persistent barrage of nighttime fireworks, is City Councilor at Large, Julia Mejia. Thank you very much for being with us, Councilor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, for inviting me.
Councilor, I want to start with the declaration of racism as a public health crisis by the mayor. It also sort of picks up from what Councilor Arroyo was doing a few months ago and from what some other officials have been doing for a long time. So put this in perspective. Is this much of a big deal right now?
Well, I mean, given the current state of affairs around the country, it is definitely a big deal. And when Councilor Arroyo utilized his opportunity for his maiden speech to declare this such, really was a telltale sign about how we have been functioning as a city. And now, given everything that we have seen after George Floyd, I mean, just for years and years and years, you know that your zip code determines your health outcomes. So depending on where you live, that's what your life expectancy looks like. And so it's a conversation that has been long in the running. I started off my career in public health 20-something years ago, and the same conversation I was having then is the same conversation that we're having now.
Well, you had a conversation, it must be at least a couple of months ago, about the mental health of people in Boston during the pandemic. We're a couple of months further along. Some things are reopening, maybe some new anxieties too. Where do you think we stand?
Yeah, I mean, I think the transition from students who were leaving schools that were at home, feeling unloved and unwelcomed and unsupported and isolation, that was, you know, that had a tremendous impact on the social and emotional mental well-being of students. The same with teachers. So that was a traumatic transition. And we really didn't give an opportunity to unpack that. We went straight into the academics of it. So there was no opportunity for people to really kind of just sink in on the fact that they're no longer going to be together. There's a lot of things that for some folks still feel uncertain in terms of whether or not we're going to go back to school. And if we do go back to school, what that's going to look like. There's some folks now who are concerned that things are opening up and they still don't have childcare in place. And so even though the childcare centers are going to be opening up at the end of the month, there's still some uncertainty about exposure, right? So people are walking back into the workforce feeling a little bit hesitant because it's still unknown where we stand with exposure. And then I also think that a lot of businesses, in terms of their own mental wellness, I mean, we put together an initiative to help support barbershops and hair salons. And some of the owners talked about their own mental distress and trauma that they experienced having to close up their shops and not sure whether or not they were going to be able to open. And now that trauma that they experienced when they had to shut down, as they start opening again, they are afraid of reliving that. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do in the mental health space, and it's something that we can't ignore. We have to center mental wellness as part of the conversation when we open up our doors, and employers need to be super mindful of making sure that they create space for their employees to really unpack that trauma.
As you well know, there has been a national wave of protests around the use of force by police, but also about the racism factor in policing. What about Boston? Is this merely about adjusting accountability, or is it about maybe being more dramatic about redefining the role of police?
Yeah, so one of the things that I had to help people understand is that the messaging was off. When people were saying defund the police, the conversation is really about how do we reallocate resources and how do we invest in things that help reduce crime, right? Like really looking at the root cause, providing more youth employment opportunities year round, not just during the summer, really looking at mental health as a factor. Instead of deploying the police, maybe deploy the best team that works with mental wellness and has a very different way of approaching people who might be experiencing bouts of mental wellness, mental health issues. So I think it's the how we utilize those dollars is what we need to look at. And it's not about taking away money from the police, it's just really reinvesting it in ways that get at the root cause of why we are experiencing crime.
One thing you want to look at on the council is what happens in the Boston schools, maybe using more restorative justice. I know there has been more attention in recent years to emotional and social well-being of students, but what's the undone work that needs to be done?
Yeah, so a lot of what I've been hearing from school police officers who are now in that role, and many of who have been in that role for the past 20-something years, are talking about making sure that we're also looking at the racial and implicit biases that exist within that department, and making sure that we have more people of color represented in leadership positions. I think that that is definitely something that needs to be looked at, and I think that we're centering the conversation around restorative justice practices, that it's not all punitive, is that that we're not feeding the school to prison pipeline, but that we're really utilizing this space to right the wrong, and making sure that we're equipping the school police officers with the resources that they need to be able to better diffuse situations and to be able to create a culture where it's not us versus them. And I think we also need more school psychologists and guidance counselors in our schools. We can't just think that everything is going to be handled with punitive measures. And I think that we need to reevaluate that completely.
You also want to look into the use of restraints by the police, and I think the department recently announced that they have been making some changes and they're more restrictive about the use of force that way. But what else would you like to see?
Yeah, so one of the things that we are proposing, we're going to be hosting a public hearing with Councilor Campbell, who is the chair of public safety. We're looking for no chokeholds, and also we want to look at tear gas too. And then I think for me, when I think about the police and protests, is that we also need to look at how we can de-escalate situations. And I would like to do a further investigation in terms of like how many officers have had X amount of number of incidences where they've had aggressive ways of responding. And if they have X amount of offenses, then maybe being deployed to a protest may not be the best course of action for this individual. So I want to look at all of that.
Well, I think if anything, there's mounting distaste for major problems with police arising out of small incidents. And all of a sudden we have to apply that lens to this outbreak of fireworks in Boston. I mean, what do you do about it?
Oh my God, Chris. And I mean, no one could sleep. So what we did from our offices last week, we hosted a community-centered conversation because we believe deep down that this is going to take all of us working in different ways to move the needle. And everything can't just be calling 311 and 911. We need an inside-outside strategy to deal with this. And I think that, I know for me growing up when I was a kid, is by the time I got home, my mom already knew what I did. And we moved away from the basics. And so my hope through this process is that we can create a community-centered approach where we're utilizing PSAs, where we're working to develop marketing messages that we can put around our neighborhoods to kind of help address this problem and center it around the trauma. And we're working with Drive, which is a nonprofit organization that is already doing a lot of the work on the outside to figure out how we can move as a collective to address this issue. Again, it's gonna take all of us. And so James Hills, who is the executive director of Drive, has been working alongside our office to address this issue as well.
You know, I noticed the Dominican flag, and I can't help but reflect on some Dominican history, which involves Christopher Columbus. His statue was vandalized recently. He means different things to different peoples as far as their history and identity. What about the Dominican perspective?
Well, you know, there is a whole monument dedicated to Christopher in the Dominican Republic. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of what history is shared and told. I think that there is a lot of pushback from the community here in the city of Boston. You know, Christopher Columbus Day should be Indigenous Day, right? I think there's some energy around that. And we've gotten to the point where a lot of folks who are living these realities recognize what the true history is, and that history needs to be told. And I think replacing some of those symbols that have stripped away our culture and our history needs to be reevaluated. And I mean, I do feel really bad about the fact that he was beheaded in the North End, and I understand also the pride for Italian Americans. And I think that we are now at a place where we need to reconcile and create space for all voices to be heard, because just what happened is not going to change or change the situation. We need to talk about it as a community and heal from that.
Finally, we should mention that whether it's fireworks or some of the other policies you're working on, do you have anything coming up online that you might want people to tune into?
This week we're going to we're thinking about hosting a community conversation around grieving during COVID-19 and how difficult that is. Because right now, folks who have lost loved ones, the funerals have changed, it's been really hard for folks to deal with grieving during these times. And so that's going to happen this Thursday during our community conversation at 6 p.m. on Facebook at Julia for Boston. That's what we're working on for this week.